Looking for some fun in your life? Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia, the book by Peter Schmitz, is now available. Order a copy from your local independent bookstore. Ask for it at your local library or go to www.aithpodcast.com and click on the easy link. In times like these, you need a book like this. Hello everyone, welcome back to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories about the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. Our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. I'm Peter Schmitz, and I am very honored and pleased today to welcome Tom Bissinger to the podcast. Tom Bissinger is an artist, a director, and a writer, and a longtime participant in the Philadelphia cultural scene. If you remember his name, that's because at the end of episode 89, we read the chapter from my book about Tom's direction of the show The Line of Least Existence in January of 1970, and the subsequent closing of the Theater of the Living Arts. In fact, it was because of that chapter that I finally got a chance to meet Tom, who has stayed in the Philadelphia area ever since then, and nowadays lives with his wife Kristen in a lovely farmstead/art studio/spiritual gathering place in the countryside to the west of the city. Tom invited me out there last month, and I was able to persuade him to come on the podcast and talk about things that didn't make it into that chapter in my book. I spoke to Tom over Zoom earlier this week, and I need to mention that much of our conversation is based upon his own 2013 book, a fascinating autobiographical memoir called The Funhouse: Memory, Magic, and Mayhem, published in 2013 by Ex Libris. I don't want to run over too much what's in that book because there's much more in it than just his work in Philly theater. Anyway, I'd like to let Tom tell us himself. So here's my recording of my chat with Tom, which I've edited down to keep it under an hour and also for sound clarity and time. Here we go. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to meet and get to know you recently, and I hope you'll forgive me for taking so long to come and find you, because you've been here longer than I have, although both of us are rivals to the area. You grew up in California, right?
San Francisco.
San Francisco, yeah. And then you went to Phillips Andover and to Stanford and had a tour in the Army. But eventually you end up around here. And now you live in a beautiful farmstead to the west of Philadelphia with your wife, Kristen, and all your art. And it's a lovely, lovely domestic scene there. I was very, very honored to be asked to come by there the other day. But I wanted to start with sort of an apology because you're in my book. Now, one of the reasons I went out there to visit you is I wanted to give you a copy of my book. And you were very gracious about it. But there's a chapter in my book in which I describe The Line of Least Existence, that musical, which was sort of the last big hurrah of the Theater of the Living Arts. And it's a great story because it involves Danny DeVito and Judd Hirsch and all sorts of amazing things that were going on there as the 60s came to an end and the theater came to an end. But I don't think I really did justice to your work in the Philadelphia theater and certainly your work along the South Street area in the 1970s. So I'm so glad to get you on the podcast and give you a chance to talk about it yourself. So you went into the Army after college. Why did you end up in the armed services?
Well, first of all, it was a universal draft system, so I had no choice. And I couldn't bring myself to trying to get out on some kind of bogus excuse. And I had 6 months. Well, I graduated from Stanford, lived in Paris for 6 months, saw a lot of great theater there, which opened my eyes to my future in the theater. And then I got a notice saying you're going to be drafted 1A unless you get back here and enroll in some kind of reserve program, which I did. And it was 6 months active, 6 month reserve, 6-year reserve. And that was the best I could find. And it was in Fort Ord, California, near San Francisco. So I just did it.
But you state that you had sort of a military heritage in your family. Father
World War II. And
right.
He was in big invasions in Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio. And Anzio was a complete disaster. And my father suffered through that. They called it battle fatigue then. So I've written and read up on what it must have been like to be in those battles where the Germans are shelling you from the shore and you're on a ship and ships are getting blown up around you and people are dying and blood and et cetera. And it had to be probably really awful. And
So
so
you imagine they came back with some PTSD from the.
and then for some reason, and I was a kid, in 1945, I turned 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And he was appointed the executive of the Morro Bay Naval Base, preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. So we moved to a naval base, which I loved. That was exciting, and all kinds of stuff, adventures there. And he loved the Navy. He truly loved it. Was a big man in politics and in the Naval Reserve in San Francisco. And so he kept all that up, but I was not a Navy man. My brother was. He went in the Navy too.
Right, right. Well, I bring up particularly the question of your father because before this in his life, he was a Broadway actor.
He was a Broadway actor and stage manager, a show called The Little Show with Fred Allen and Clifton Webb and Portland Hoffa. And I have pictures of him, glossies of him escorting beautiful showgirls on both.
Yeah.
Atlantic City, where
Libby Holman was in it, the great torch singer.
So it was a hit.
Yeah.
And he thought, and then his father said, "You got to come back in the family business," which was hides, wool, and tallow, far cry from theater. But he always loved theater. He shared it with me. He belonged to a Concordia club, which put on shows every year that they wrote. And I remember his two friends, Sloss and Glickbart, and him in our downstairs living room writing the show. And I thought, God, this is glamorous. This is really neat. And then when I'd go to the Concordia Club and see the show, and every musical that came out from New York with the first run cast, and it was always the first run cast in the 40s and early 50s, we saw every single one. So, and when I was 8, he took me back east, took us all back east on the City of San Francisco train, and we saw High Button Shoes, directed by, I think, Jerome Robbins, or he did
Yeah.
And I just was smitten. Like, this was the greatest thing I ever saw in my life. So bless my father for giving me that opportunity. I have to bookend it by saying that when I left the theater in 1970, after TLA closed, the year before, while I was at the theater, my father died.
Right.
Shortly, but he had been ill for quite a while.
Right. We'll get to that. It was during the rehearsals of Recruiting Officer he passed away.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was brutal. And I was, not on great terms with him at that time because I was a hippie and he was, more conservative.
Right. Straight-laced.
He wasn't like a hard right conservative or anybody, but in the way you dressed, he liked appropriate attire and hair and all that.
And what did you look like in the 1960s?
I had an afro. I actually had an afro. It was just because my hair gets curly and it just was a big bush.
Right.
And, I mean, we went along with, the prevailing,
And you're a very tall man and slender and very striking looking, right? So you also had, you describe yourself in the book wearing bell bottoms and beads.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
Today it would be a complete caricature, but at the time everybody else was doing it.
You had integrity, I think. I think you were being one with the moment. Yeah. But after you leave the Army, now you're in 1962, you arrive in New York City. You arrive about the same time as young Bob Dylan's arriving.
A complete unknown.
Yes.
A complete unknown, Peter. And that's true. I had no connections. There's no one say, "Oh yeah, we'll give you a boost." Right. And so I saw the thing was to take a lot of classes. I took classes with Alan Schneider, Harold Klerman.
Some veterans of Stanislavski, right? You said some of Stanislavski's old Russian company.
I got that when I was in the theater out in Palo Alto. A guy came out from Actors Studio who was a trip. I'll just leave it at that. And but it was, we did a Brecht play, and it was really fun to do. But he was a brutal director. I didn't like his tactics, but Yeah, the actor's studio I was okay with that, but I mean, I never was there. I wasn't, a complete like aficionado of the method, but at
Right.
the same time, yeah, man, I was just for good acting.
Right.
However,
But the type of theater you seem to be most attracted to, and which would be typical of the time, is not realistic theater or Broadway type theater, but
right.
absurdist drama, Brechtian drama, highly theatricalized and subversive text. You end up working at La Mama, where Ellen Stewart was
Those
forming.
guys, I
Yeah.
did it, Mama, yeah. And I did the trial of Julian Beck and Judith Malina. And I forget what else I did there, but yeah, that was cool. And you
You
brought
describe in your book that you, as you were walking into La Mama, you'd pass these two stone hippies on the stairs, Jerome Ragney and Tom
Oh yeah,
Burton,
yeah,
who
they're
were
writing
working on
there.
hair. Yeah,
I was part of the open theater led by Joe Chaikin. So
right,
I went to their workshops, and I wasn't close with Joe, but I definitely knew him. And Ragney and those two guys were yeah, sitting out there writing hair.
right. So you start working at the American Place Theater, which is sort of a later ended up in the Times Square area, but that and again another sort of off Broadway.
At the St. Clement's Church on like West 55th or something.
Right.
And it was
I
well regarded. And the play, oh, I had so much fun with that play, but my God, the audience left in droves. They just detested it. It was very sexual, highly sexualized. All I can tell you, New York audiences, for all their sophistication, man, it's a veneer. And a lot of these very hip people, man, you can scratch the surface and they'll bolt out of their seats.
no.
They're not quite as discriminating or whatever.
Well, what I found about
Thing.
New York audiences is that what they really don't want to be associated with is something that's not a success.
Right.
Right. So if it looks like, oh, this isn't where it's happening, they get out right away. They're not going to invest their time in something that's going to not say, oh, I was there. I was there when that great thing happened. If it's not going to be Hair or Hamilton or whatever, they're like, okay, we're out. We're not here to be associated with
You want to hear
fame.
an anecdote from that play?
Yeah.
There was, I think, a funny one, maybe sort of sums up what I just previously said, which was one night Wayne Tippett, who was a pretty well-known actor, got sick. And they said, Tom, you got to do it. Take the lead role. And, I didn't know the lines. I held a script. It's called The Young Masked Dante. And so at one point, Dante's lying down on a table and there's a trapdoor behind his behind. And I reached, and he's naked. But you can see that his buttocks are revealed.
Hmm.
And you reach down, and I was pulling out hamburgers and Coke bottles and palm olive oil or whatever, just commercial product. But I had never done this because Wayne had done it. So I reached down and I grabbed his testicles by mistake and start to pull, and he's going whoop like that. And
Those don't come off.
yeah, I let go of them, but it was like unexpected, that
Right.
kind of thing happened. But
Yeah.
the audience was revolted, I guess, or amused, whichever way
Right.
you want to see it by that kind of thing.
But you were working on a Sam Shepard play, La Turista. It's one of his
So,
early plays, which is set in Mexico, which involves a live chicken, and we'll come back to that. But did that start in New York and then go to the Theater of the Living Arts, or did you go down to Philadelphia to
no,
work
I
at the
had
Theater of the
never
Living
been
Arts?
there, and somehow they contacted my agent. Would I like to direct La Turista? And of course, I said yeah. And I very much admired Sam Shepard's work. I went then down there and directed the play well enough, I guess, so that John Boss, the producer at the TLA, hired me to direct, be the
Well,
art.
so this was your first real time ever spending time in the city of Philadelphia at that?
Oh no, I went
No?
down one time before when I was with a theater group, and we did, Thornton. I think it was Thornton Wilder wrote these 27 little plays, or a whole lot of very like 5-minute plays, and one was about Mozart, the death of Mozart. And I remember we went down to the Bellevue Stratford, and I don't know why we went there, but we went there. We performed these plays, and I remember walking down South Street just for something to do. And this is like, let's say, 67. And it was like a bombed out nothing. There was nothing moving. I said, this is so slow. Nothing moves here. And there were just a bunch of mostly elderly Black people and some old Jews. And it was like surrealistic. And then a year or two later, I end up living there.
Yeah, so you had were hired to do this play called Scuba Duba, right? It was starring Dick Shawn, who most people might know if they know the movie The Producers. He played the Hitler character in Springtime for Hitler. Um,
Wonderful.
yeah,
Wonderful.
amazing comic actor. What was Scuba Duba about?
Duba Duba was about sort of political incorrectness, as best I can recall. And, he's flopping around in scuba gear. And I guess on an island, he has a wife, Jennifer Warren, I think her name was. I mean, the actress. And then this sort of nymphy, really hot babe that I fell in love with called Judy West. Anyway, so we actually played at two places. We played in New Jersey in
The Paramus Mall or
yeah,
something.
yeah,
Yeah.
one of those theaters there. We took it there, and then we went to Philly with it. It was a big hit. I mean, people loved it, and Shawn was excellent.
So you
And
took it to the Playhouse in the Park, which is not too far from where I'm sitting right now. No longer there. I discussed it in the book and elsewhere on the podcast. So this is a play they sort of brought in the way that they brought in Marat Sade and other plays that came in up at the time. But how did it go over in Philadelphia? This because it had a lot of very
it was,
explicit
I
language
think
in it.
people liked it. There were a lot of MF words in it and stuff, but Rizzo heard about it. He didn't like
Mayor
it.
Frank Rizzo.
Oh, mayor, or at that time police
Oh,
commissioner.
that's right. He was police commissioner then.
Yeah,
Yes.
and he wanted to close the place unless we excised the words. Well, of course, nothing feeds the box office like being censored, and that just put us over the top. And Shawn would come to the words and say, "Why, you censored person," and he'd get a laugh every time he said censored. And, the play went on. And, we didn't need the words. It wasn't going to make or break the play, but Shawn made fun of it.
And by that time, you had already applied for the job of the theater, to be
Yeah,
the
I
new
think
artistic
I might
director of
have
Living
even
Arts.
gotten it by that point.
Yeah. But so what was your understanding? I mean, Andre Gregory by that time had famously left, been fired, been eased out, and the theater had gone on for a couple of years now without him.
Yeah.
What had you known about that whole story? What was your sort
I
of
knew almost nothing about it. I knew that Andre was, and I've never met Andre. I knew he was a really interesting avant-garde director, and then he was very into Grotowski. I
right?
knew about Grotowski, and so he was a far edge explorer. I admired him for that. And why he got fired, I evidently, his plays were too far out. And it seemed like I followed in his footsteps in a certain way. And as I think I've told you elsewhere, that had I known a little more today, what I know today, I might have changed things around a bit. But I was given complete license to do whatever I wanted to do.
So John Boss was then the managing director of the theater, and you developed a nice relationship with him.
He's a wonderful guy. He was a wonderful guy, a man, I think, of great integrity. He died a couple of months ago. And he was able to talk to people, especially the mainline board who put up the money for the theater, and convince them that these were good things and I was a good person. And they made a lot out of my coming. I mean, there's a full page ad in the Inquirer in 1969 with me with dark glasses, my afro haircut, saying, "This man will give you 6 of the best nights of your life." It might mean.
Well, excuse me, I fan myself.
Well,
My goodness.
season around me somewhat. And then, and we had great actors. I mean, it wasn't about me, but they had to start with something.
Well, they had a company, right? There were
Yeah.
actors. You had people that you didn't have to assemble a group from out of New York.
I
There were
did.
people you
No,
did.
no, I
Did you bring everybody
assembled.
in?
I brought in Morgan and
Morgan Freeman, I should say at this point. Yeah.
Morgan Freeman and Judd Hirsch. And Sally Kirkland was an old member, but had been there. Michael Procaccino might have been there. I don't, and now he has a new name because he
Michael
won,
Christopher.
Christopher.
Right.
and and then there were other people that were, yes, there were some basic kind of regular, but the stars, I asked them to come down.
Was it hard to persuade New York actors to come down to Philadelphia for a
No,
while?
no,
No?
I don't think so. I think they liked the fact that they were going to work, and
Yeah.
they were, hungry, and
Right.
they hadn't achieved the fame yet.
So do you feel like you discovered Morgan Freeman in a little way? No,
I
he was already
I
known.
think he was already from Scuba Dooba well known, and
Oh, he
but
was in Scuba Duba as well?
yeah, but I was fortunate enough to be able to get them to come down,
Right.
and I very much like working with them.
So you moved down to Philadelphia and you get a little house there near the theater
Yeah,
in this sort of bombed out area. What was that real estate visit like?
uh, well, had I not gotten divorced while I was living there, I probably still have the house, although I don't think I'd be living there. But the house was, I could have bought this wonderful old colonial house for $15,000 right on the corner of Monroe and Second Street in Queen Village. But it was a bombed out neighborhood. I mean, you walk, what it reminded me of was London in the fog and Dickens. I had been to London, but it just seemed like this lonely, desolate outpost, the South Street area, and even further where I lived. It was in
But it
fog.
wasn't that far from central Philadelphia. It's
Oh,
just
15
it's
minute
just a
walk
20,
here
yeah.
in Center City. I mean, that's why I never understood. I said, how could this be right in the center of Philadelphia, and it's a slum? Of course, they wanted to put the freeway through there.
It was they expected a freeway to come through it any day, and nobody
And,
knew that wasn't going to work.
and
Yeah.
as your life unfolds and you maybe become who you didn't know you wanted to be, but your seed sort of unfolds, is that I became part of a neighborhood after the TLA closed called South Street, and South Street Renaissance, whatever you want to call it, where all these hippies showed up from around the world and said, wow, it's cheap. Everything is really cheap here. Let's just start a restaurant. Let's start a bakery. Let's deal dope. Let's play music, whatever. It just was right for me at that time, especially after the TLA closed.
Right. Well, let's get through the whole of that story. So you arrive in town. You're promising everyone six of the most wonderful nights of their life, or they
Yeah.
could come more often than that if they want to. But you choose for your first play this 18th century restoration comedy called The Recruiting Officer by George Farquhar. Farquhar, for those of you following along at home. Now, this is a famous play, and I happen to be teaching it right now, by the way, in my own
Oh,
class at Temple. Well, because Temple University is now staging a production of Our Country's Good by Timberlake Wharton Baker, which is about convicts in Australia putting on The Recruiting Officer, right? And The Recruiting Officer was the first play ever done in New York City, by the way. It was such a standard work in the 18th century that, of course, that's what you turned to. It's a rollicking comedy. It's bawdy. It's got lots of good roles. And it's about a military culture that everybody would have been familiar with at the time. It takes place in Shrewsbury, in Western England. And it basically, I know you know the plot, but I'm reciting it for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with it. It's about two men who are after two different women, but the women have agency, unlike a lot of 18th and later 19th century play. The women are also very active in seeking out their desires and wants. But it begins with a Sergeant Kite coming in and recruiting the local yokels into the British Army, which was just beginning its sort of expansionist, imperialist mission in the world, and suborning them, bribing them, finding ways to trick them into being in the army. And eventually, over the course of the play, one of the young women, these two young guys are going after these two women who have certain fortunes as well as physical attraction. And one of the young women disguises herself as a man, again, a very common, 17th and 18th century theatrical trope, and pretends to enlist in the army in order to get close to this young man. And, well, complications ensue. By the end, of course, everyone is together with the person they're supposed to be together with. There is a comic moment where the young woman dressed as a young man ends up in bed with a young country girl. So there's a lot of sort of ribald, jest throughout it. But it's delightfully constructed, and usually, if you can get past the 18th century language, works like gangbusters. But why did you pick it? Why did you go, this is what I need to start with?
I picked it because it had something to do with war. We were in the thick of Vietnam, and I wanted to address that issue. But I didn't want to make it a polemic. I wanted to find a vehicle that could be witty and fun and sexy, and as it turned out, musical, and see if I could get away with it. And without really knowing a lot of the pedigree of this play, I mean, I'm not a restoration comedy,
You're not a theater historian. Yeah,
read a lot of that stuff.
right.
But as I was reading it, I started to see, and unfortunately, I don't have a copy or anything of the script. I realized I could start juxtaposing and moving scenes around and changing the script, which I did boldly, I would say.
Well, it's in the public domain. Farquhar's been dead since
Yeah,
1709 or whatever. Yeah.
but reckless possibly. But for my purposes, it worked perfectly. And then I thought, wow, there's music in there because I don't remember, but there's drummers and stuff. And I said, let's get some music. And John said, well, there's this local group called Good News consisting of Larry Gold and Michael Bacon. And I'll bring them in. And they were young guys, younger than me, a little younger. And I said, guys, I want some music for this. And I've heard your CD and I love this song. And
Well,
this.
you didn't say CD back then. You must have said
Well, it was
a
something.
tape. Must have been a reel-to-reel tape. Maybe a cassette. Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
And but I had heard something. And so they said they were up for it. So I thought, okay, I've got the script and we'll juggle it around. I've got these actors, I've got music. And Eugene Lee was the set designer. And Eugene built a beautiful set with a sloped ramp with enough lift from one step to another that the musicians could be under the stage, but they could look out and see the audience. They can't see any of the actors, but they could see the audience. And so the two guys were down there, and it just was a wonderful cast that caught the spirit of the thing. And such were some of the idiosyncrasies that we had. Larry Block was one of the members. He became a fairly well-known actor. And at intermission, he delivered a diatribe about Vietnam, which actually alienated some of the audience.
Yes, we'll get to that. That's mentioned in a review I want to read to you. Yeah.
I mean, so we tried all kinds of stuff and just broke a lot of rules. And it seemed, in this case, to just work perfectly, as opposed to maybe the last production.
Well, all right. Before we get to that, so you've got something that's working. Did you know, by the way, that Mr. Bacon was the son of Ed Bacon, the big city planner, the guy that was trying to drive this highway across South Street?
I told that, but it didn't really
Didn't register.
Ed. I did get to become friends with Ed because he loved the theater and he loved what we were doing, just loved it.
But on the whole, you're coming in not particularly part of the Philadelphia establishment with not really a lot of knowledge about the local scene, but you make a splash. You have an arrival. There was this huge spread in the Sunday Inquirer, which has got wonderful pictures from it, including close-ups of Sally Kirkland. There's an article from the Philadelphia Daily News, which interviews you. You say the original play is largely unrecognizable, says Tom, who notes that while British dramatist George Farquhar's text has been cut, nothing has been rewritten. We've added 14 new songs, which run the gamut from rock to traditional martial airs. The lyrics were written after research into the writings of Farquhar and 18th century songs. Comedy will not be played in its own period and style. And the multi-level set, it mentions, includes an arena and a circus tent, and the action will move with the audience, says Bissinger. So it mentions that in the cast is Judd Hirsch, playing the part of the father, the local magistrate, and Michael Procaccino as country gentleman, Marion Killinger and David Rounds as the recruiting officers, and Morgan Freeman as the recruiting sergeant, Sally Kirkland and Jean DeBear as the ladies of fortune. But you say in this interview that recruiting and war are basically sports in which all participants are spectators. What did you mean by that? Or what do you remember meaning by that at the time?
Well, it's something I've dwelt with in my writing as well, that there's a sort of the pornography of war that we, for instance, as mostly well-fed Americans, get to watch the war in Ukraine and Sudan, in Gaza. You pick your poison with impunity. You know, really, unless we have relatives there, it's not really our war. And also, as you recall, in the Vietnam War, they had the TV embedded in the war, which they never will allow after that. So that you got nightly news of total disasters every night. And so we were living with that. That was a
No,
sort
I
of
remember that as a kid. You would watch, they would have like, here's the body count, of the how many people we killed yesterday. Yeah.
so I think you couldn't not want to bring it forth and sort of, and I was also very much in love with Brecht and his I forget what they call his distancing or whatever. I'm not sure I ever understood what he meant by that. I never uh I don't think I ever saw a Berliner ensemble show, but I read his books
Mhm.
and performed his plays. So I don't know. There was just a stew of things that were occurring at that time that I wanted to take advantage of, if you will.
Well, it seems to have rubbed some local critics the wrong way. Now, I don't know if you ever saw this review because it was printed not in a Philadelphia paper, but in the a Wilmington paper, in the Delaware Morning News, a critic named Otto Dekom, Dekom. Do you remember this? Did you ever see this before? The title of this review Tom, is Play's Revival is Vulgar. It says director Tom Bissinger has presumed to, in quotes, update and improve one of the classics of English theater. These impudent puppies of the theater seem to think they invented all human experience yesterday morning. Any great play, even one 263 years old, speaks the universal language of humanity. It does not need modernization any more than the Mona Lisa needs a mustache. And he goes on from there. You were actually called an impudent puppy.
Or worse.
Yeah, well, if I don't know if I got that review, it must have been sort of like reading the reviews for Scuba Doo. We go, we're in. This is great. If this guy hates it so much, we must be doing this right.
And it's also, I think, and what comes to my mind is the patriarchy reacting, the white patriarchy saying this is not the way things are supposed to be.
Yeah, he mentions that speech in the lobby, and he's not at all happy about that.
Oh,
He can also calls you a sick hippie as well as a sick puppy. By the way, political propaganda has been carried to extremes. Even during intermission, the audience is harangued by members of the cast with Viet Cong type propaganda. We are told, among other things, that those who love America are idiots. All right, so he was not happy with you.
not happy.
But meanwhile, William Collins, who was then a fairly new reviewer at the Inquirer, had been reviewing plays throughout the 60s and would continue throughout the 70s and 80s. We've quoted him many times. And eventually, the dear man, actually, after he retires from being a critic, becomes an actor again. He works in Philadelphia theater in the 1990s as an actor. But he loved the show, Tom. He loved it. And he wrote this rave review, which, of course, the TLA with John Boston put in right in the ad because his review starts air of celebration prevails in the recruiting officer. He says the Theater of the Living Arts cast off its season Tuesday night with a fresh and wildly newfangled production of the restoration comedy, The Recruiting Officer. The company assembled by Tom Bissinger for his first production as artistic director at the South Street establishment radiated a joyful energy as they tackled the classic with everything from gunpowder to rock. There was an air of celebration in the event, something in the nature of a shipboard party in a midnight sailing, what with Bissinger's promise to pilot us into uncharted seas of theatrical pleasure. So that's what I call a rave.
Aside from that, Bill and I became quite good friends, and I really loved the guy. He was very, very positive for our theater and a very nice human being.
what was your experience of what the Philadelphia audience were like? They're still coming to South Street after many times of being maybe discouraged, and they're showing up at this place in droves.
It was excellent. So I take tremendous happiness and pride in the production. And, as I say, if you don't have it well acted and performed, I mean, it's not me doing it up there.
Right.
But it was joyful. And every night we did, we sang some of the songs backstage before we went on stage. And, the whole cast, they're just singing along with them, playing on the guitar. And I mean, in rehearsals, I would do yoga with them, like, I don't even know if they could do that today. Maybe.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, everybody get down. We're going to do 30 minutes on the mat of yoga, and not that I knew that much about it, but
Well, it sounds like you were a spiritual leader of the production as well as the sort of artistic leader. They were with you. And did you look at? I mean, you have a young Morgan Freeman there. Are you looking and going like, well, here's a major actor of the world? Or are you just going,
yeah,
oh, is this guy I
well,
found?
Morgan, and I can't even repeat the stories about his behavior off stage. But he lived at some hotel, and evidently, I mean, I don't know whether he left the water on and totally flooded the room or did stuff. I mean, there was stuff I didn't know anything about. He was easy to work with, and he had a certain, I would say a dynamic of being a black actor. And I
Hmm.
wasn't all that familiar with working with black actors,
Hmm.
actresses, so I think there were a couple times I kind of stumbled where maybe I didn't quite know or use the right words to, or maybe was
Hmm.
trying to assume a familiarity about something that, but I mean, he didn't rebuke me, just so, would look at me and a big guy, tall guy,
Yeah.
and I mean, now you can't go anywhere without seeing me in some ad or movie or whatever,
Right.
but
Do you
he
ever?
was fun. And he
Yeah.
was excellent. He was just excellent.
And Judd Hirsch is playing the part of the justice. And you remark in your book that he was a very professional actor. He was,
Oh man, he
you know,
just so solid. A real. This sounds insulting. I don't know how else to put it. He was a businessman, meaning he is a wonderful actor. I mean, can do anything. I mean, excellent. But he also took care of his business. He wasn't like a starving guy. He had a house, a farm in Bucks County. He just knew how to keep his life going and maintain himself, as well as eating up every part he could get and
right.
playing. So he was a mensch. He was a real mensch.
Well, so as we mentioned earlier, in the middle of the rehearsal process for the greeting officer, your father dies suddenly. He's on a trip to London with your mother, and he'd been ill, and he'd had cancer or something before that.
He had cancer. Yeah, he had cancer, and then he had a heart attack, and then a stroke, which rendered him unable to talk or do anything but blink his eyes. And then they flew him back home, and he died thereafter.
Right. So
And
you had to go back to
unfortunately,
California to the
I
funeral.
did not. I did not.
No?
And I didn't go to London either. I mean, I had
Oh,
just started. I was there like, I don't know. I think he died like the beginning of October, maybe. And, we had started in September. I mean, I was 2 weeks into rehearsals. And, and given the intricacy of this play and how I rearranged it, there was just no way I could leave. And to compound matters for me personally, I was not on good terms with him when he left. The last time we met was a complete disaster in California that summer, in which we were just screaming at each other and you're disgusting, you look awful, and clean yourself up, and F you, what is my, blah, 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 blah. And all I can say is it took me many years of some therapy and work on myself to come to terms with his death and him and our behavior with each other. And, and then occasionally through the years, I've had dreams of him showing up and very strange dreams. The last one, which was a number of years ago, I introduced myself. I said, hi. Oh, and he walks in. I know exactly who he is. I say, hi, I'm Tom Bissinger. And he says, oh, yeah, I know who you are. And we hug. And then this behind me is like a chorus of about 20 robed women with my wife right in the center, so the lead woman, and they're singing like a hymn or some kind of thing. Very beautiful, kind of spiritually directed music, singing while we embraced. but it took a long time and some Gestalt therapy to really, work my way through the pain and of a disastrous.
Well, it's interesting because we just talked to Mary Robinson, who was the head of the Philadelphia Theater Guild in the 90s, about how she was dealing not only with the birth of her young son there, but her own mother was ill and passing away, who she had a good relationship with. But it was something that she had never really talked about at the time, but she felt that she needed to get on with the work that she was doing. And you can, felt a commitment to the work you're doing at TLA. In fact, you opened a new space behind the theater, right? You wanted an alternate space, and what did you find to work in?
There was an old garage right behind. There's an alley and then an old garage, 2-floor garage. And I said, I want to stage a play in here. John, boss.
Did it belong to the theater? Was it part of the building complex? Or did they have to rent it?
Good question. I think it was. I think we did own it, and maybe we stored stuff there.
Oh, okay.
I think we stored I think it was actually, yes, the downstairs was where we worked on the flats and built the scenery. So it was a scenery shop downstairs. Upstairs was just a big empty floor. Was all. And I said, I'd like to direct this gargoyle cartoons there. That really interests me. By Michael McClure. And so we just went ahead and did it. And again, it was a big, big hit, a very psychedelic kind of play. The plays themselves were short, cartoonish plays, very brilliant. Michael McClure was a beautiful poet. And
from San Francisco.
I went out, I met him, very sweet guy, very fine writer. And he was delighted that we were going to do these plays. Very few professional theater companies were interested in doing these plays. And I had my sort of second string actors, the ones that weren't the big names like Judd or Morgan, in these plays, and they were terrific. And I'll just tell you, because I thought this never would be allowed again. And it was a very big space. We created like a stretch cloth that was maybe, let's say, it was 30 by 60 feet. We had slits in it, and the audience went in and put their heads. We had mats. Everyone sat on a cushion with their head through this billowing thing, so it was resting on your shoulders. And then there were certain things that were marked for the actors, for the 5 actors in this one play. It was all supposed to take place in heaven or out in space or something like that. And so the whole play was done with great lights and them popping up maybe right next to you or across from you and doing this wonderful dialogue and very spacey, you can imagine. So that was kind of one of the plays.
But it was shut down. But the city got after you. The building inspectors decided that this is a fire hazard.
Yeah, the rats, and there weren't rats, but they were rats.
Well, they made a lot of trouble for a lot of avant-garde theater companies. I've seen that story before. L&I, it was called License and Inspections, got after us and shut us down.
And then Larry Maggot of the Electric Factory invited us to stage it over there, so we went over there and did it.
Wow. So this is also sort of a success d'estime, perhaps it's not so much in the box office, but in your book, you say your big mistake was allowing the recruiting officer to close, that you felt like it's the common dilemma of repertory theaters, in that you set up a schedule of shows and they're meant to run for 3 to 6 weeks, and then you move on to the next one. But if you've got a show that is selling out every night, you feel like how can you close it? More people want to see it. You could keep people coming in, but you felt like you stuck to the model and allowed the show to be over. And in the book, you say, I never should have done that.
Anyone who's listening to this podcast who is a director, a theater artistic director, going to be one, keep that in mind. If you have a hit, extend it, run it. Do not close. You'll deal with the rest of it later, but do not close a hit.
But instead, you moved on to the infamous the line of least existence, right? With this, and we described that in the book. So at this point, I'm just going to read the chapter in the book, find the book. There it is. Of course, that's got not only Judd Hirsch, but Danny DeVito in it. How did you get Danny DeVito to come down to Philadelphia to do a show?
Danny was back to the American Place Theater, and the play was called Young Master Dante, and Danny was in that. And I guess that's where I first met him.
Right.
So he seemed, you needed someone to play a part of a talking dog, a personality, wiseacring dog, and
Yeah.
Danny seemed to fit the bill. And I guess he was free.
All the reviews, they all loved him.
Oh yeah,
If people hated the line of least existence, they all said, "But this guy, Danny DeVito, playing the dog, that was hysterical."
he was hysterical. And
Yeah.
Judd was good, and the rest of it was, as a French word, dégueulasse. It was pretty much a disaster with some unbelievable, memorable moments that like.
Well, I see that you had a large, like 6 foot tall penis that erupts toward
Oh
at
no,
the
it was
end
more
of
than 6 foot. It
or
was,
it's more than
oh God,
six.
it was 10 feet, blow
Okay.
model that was about 2 feet wide and ejaculated all these soap suds all over the floor at the end of Act One, and which in a way was really a metaphor for the whole show.
Right.
Was, I don't know what it was. It was what it was, and it and also it was fine as a little off-Broadway show at a La Mama, something that,
It had a New York
yeah,
experience
and to
before
be on a
that.
big
Yeah.
stage in Philadelphia, or any stage, big stage, it just exposed. It didn't have the bones to be, solid like that.
Well, the idea was that it would be the next Hair, that maybe it could go on if it was enough counterculture, if it was crazy enough, if it was chaotic enough, it would repeat the success of that show, maybe. That seemed to have been the hope, from what I can tell.
I needed a handler at that time to say, Tom, let's see, what other choices could we make here? And I was giving
Well, I'm,
launch.
I'm wondering though, looking back at it now, if you say you recently experienced the loss, of your father, and you had had a very, complex relationship with him, if this was all beginning to sort of settle now, you're now, 3 or 4 months on, and you're that was there was you were trying to keep so many balls in the air, emotionally and professionally, that there's too much going on. Sometimes we ask so much of our uh, artists who are create something. Okay, that was great. Now do it again right away. And no matter how you're feeling, you have to keep this on this production schedule.
Yeah, and I was in love with this Judy West, who was in the play before, which we haven't talked about, Harry Noon and Night, which I didn't direct, which was a disaster as well for other reasons. And so I was, 1 hour long distance call to LA or wherever where she might be working, and like stewing in my juices that way. And, there were all kind. I mean, that's not an excuse. That's just part of the gestalt of where I was at. But yeah, it all came to a head.
Right.
And, there, as old Mr. Epstein, who ran the lingerie store on 4th Street, which I later rented and turned into something called WPCP. He said, there must be a reason. There must be a reason. I never know what the reason is, but
Right.
there must be one. And so,
Well, the one saving grace is that you've begun to get involved with this neighborhood. I mean, for instance, there was a neighborhood chicken dealer where you could get live chickens to bring in for the recruiting officer, because I read in the review, live chickens on stage, which is always a challenge. But there's neighborhood poultry dealers who can supply you with live chickens. And you are living in this historic house in this neighborhood, and the Theater of the Living Arts essentially goes bust. The board of directors decides to shut it down. There's a sort of a huge auction. You hold sort of a mass. Read about. There's sort of a
yeah.
black mass, sort of ceremony where you sort of bid goodbye to it, and the items of the set pieces and costumes are auctioned off. And members of the main line are coming in and buying these set pieces and weird costumes from the recruiting officer and line of least existence, and walking away with them. And then but you're still there. You don't leave. You stay in town. Why
Yeah.
do you stay?
Well, that's a question for the psychiatrist I don't have. But I would say that there was something blossoming in front of me of something new, of a neighborhood. And I loved it. I loved being part of a scene that was just burgeoning. I liked the people. They were great people. It was, everybody had time for you. You could, you walk down the street, you run into someone, you spend half an hour talking to them. No one was in a hurry to do anything, it seemed in those days. And it was all new and fresh and adventurous. And everybody came with very little baggage. And even I had little baggage, even though I had been the director. It wasn't, oh, he was the director. No, no one even knew, 90% didn't even know about the theater.
So the people who were living just a couple blocks away from the theater just never strolled in to see the
Probably
play?
not. Yeah,
No.
probably not. No. It was like, oh, that's theater and I'm rock and roll, and so I don't do that. So and I didn't mind. That was great. And so it became theater of the streets. And all of a sudden that was very real. And
So
uh
yeah, when you say theater of the streets, describe this big plastic structure that you
oh God,
created.
that was so great. Well, we had these South Street days, and there was a guy named Al Johnson. He had a company called Alley Friends, pretty well-known architect with Woody Stang, Strange Stang. And he blew up this huge right on Passyunk on Fifth Street. There's a triangle there. I think there's a cleaners there now, and it was an empty lot. And we blew up a huge balloon that was big enough that you could put maybe 100 people in it. And we had this band, and on the South Street day, we blew it up. The cops came and said, "What are you doing? You have a permit for this?" "Oh yeah, we're covered by the South Street Renaissance." Okay, all right, don't worry, it's all good. And we had a lot of spray paint because there was the Fifth and South Street gang, and we did not want any trouble or anyone slashing this membrane, just a membrane. Inside, they're playing rock and roll. People are coming in and dancing. There are drunks, there are tourists, there are society ladies, there are hippies. And when the gang came around, we gave them spray can and said, "Here, tag it, tag the thing." So they thought that was cool, and they did that. Probably was toxic, but it there was no one got hurt. That was always the motto: no one gets hurt. And that'll be a success. And it was mind blowing. And so, if you want to follow the trajectory of my career, so to speak, to do a recruiting officer and then to do a balloon on South Street, which is just a thin membrane that anyone could destroy, and didn't, and have the time of their life, man, that's a success for me.
Yeah. Well, you did a couple other directing gigs. You mentioned in your book doing a gig at the Academy of Music called The Black Experience of Philadelphia with Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee.
Yeah.
How did you get involved with that?
Sam Evans was the godfather at that time of black godfather of artistic things in
Right.
Philly. And, he put on distinguished events, not rock and roll, but, classical and whatever. As best I know, I don't really know much about his resume right now, but he called John and said, "I want you and Tom to, manage getting this black experience in Philadelphia. We have a script, but we need a director to just, handle it." So I went in, and it was only a few rehearsals, and I mean, I was pretty awestruck, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, and I wasn't going to tell them very much. And especially it's the black experience, and I'm some white hippie. Like, what the hell do I know
Well,
about?
you had a little cred. Let me
I
say at
do
this
have
point that
cred.
you
Yeah,
had gone down to Selma during
yeah.
the height of the demonstration that you had demonstrated. You'd been there when
I
Martin Luther
walked.
King was there. You had put your body on the line.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I hope I mentioned that lightly to Ozzy or something,
right.
whatever I might have done. And mostly I kept thinking as I'm directing, then I'm standing in the Academy of Music, and I said, "Man, I played the Academy of Music."
Yeah, it's a
I
great
just
play.
felt so grateful and awed to be in there as a
It's quite
director.
different than the Theater of the Living Arts.
Oh
Quite different
yeah,
than South
oh yeah.
Street. Yeah,
And I could tell you nothing about the play. I mean, it
right,
was sort of a historical recital of stuff, and
right.
the people came out to see the stars,
Of
and
course.
it was what it was.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think, why was I hired? Well, they never told me why I was hired, but I think they figured I could, keep it together.
Just the logistics. They just wanted somebody to
The
handle
logistics.
logistics, and
They
you can
weren't
do a
looking
big
for a
complex
million.
show. Yeah, if you can put on the line of least existence, you can put on this show. Well, anyway, about this point in time, though, we're now in the early 1970s. You leave the theater in a certain way. You move on personally and artistically. Did you make a conscious decision, or is it just the way your life worked out?
I think it was both. it was a conscious decision because I felt I don't ever want to work with a bunch of neurotic actors again. And in the line of least existence, there were plenty. Not the stars that we've already mentioned. They were
Hmm.
great, Danny and Judd. And
Well, it's about 50 people in the cast. As I'm
yeah,
looking at
it's
this
huge.
huge, yeah.
And you know, and all of a sudden I realized, God, I don't know who I am. Why am I trying to work with other neurotic people? I'm as neurotic as they are, and I just don't want to do this anymore. And so I happily just sort of abandoned that. And I was invited. I mean, that year I was invited to, I think they had Shakespeare out on the main line. I forget what it was, but a pretty well-known guy was running. They invited me to direct there, and I said, no, I don't want to do it. And
You were asked to do a Broadway show as well.
yeah, I turned down a Broadway show absolutely three times. I mean, I felt like Peter denying Jesus, you know, and not that the guy around the music fair, Lee, whatever his name was, married to Barbara Walters. Um, yeah, he asked me to direct this play about the Rosenbergs.
Right.
And I read it and I said, I don't like this play. I don't think it's a good play. You know, I mean, I can't get enthusiastic working on a play I don't believe in and then try and just because I'm going to get a Broadway credit, I'll probably be fired before that by that time. But I just couldn't go for it, you know. And so I turned that down. I turned the Shakespeare down and kind of never looked back. And then I staged things I wrote a musical about South Street called AB's Last Stand, and that was very popular,
Where
very
did you perform that? Where was that stage?
Painted Bride Art Center. Called it
Which is just a small storefront theater on
Yeah,
South Street, a few
exactly.
blocks down.
Really, yeah, with maybe 60 people or you could get in there or something like that.
Right.
And we ran it for a weekend. It was a big hit. It was wonderful and funny and celebrating the local characters, the real local characters. I mean, I disguised their names a little bit, but Isaiah Zagar was there from the Eyes Gallery and the Snydermans from the Works Gallery and David, what's his name from the famous Delicatessen and I mean, I changed their names and stuff, but it was just having a lot of fun. And it all pivoted around Abby, who I played, who was this real old fruit peddler. And I don't know, it was just fun. And I was living in the country at the time. I drove in every night to Philly or every
And
afternoon.
that time you had bought the place where you're living right now, where you're speaking to me from.
Drive in and work with
Yeah.
Joe Spivak, a friend of mine. And afterwards, and, rewrite the script a bit and come back the next day and we did it. And so, I kept my hand in. I started writing plays and had them performed in different places. But it was, Peter, you know this better, far more than I do. It takes so much work to put on a play, to get everything together, to be able to produce it. And it was like, I'm not up for that anymore.
Hmm.
Just not up. And if I am up for it, I want it all laid out on silver platter. I want a great set. I want great costumes. I want it all. But I'm at this point in my life now. I'm not interested, and I wasn't even much then. I got a little tempted occasionally. Once I went to New York and humiliated myself, sort of trying to go in and say, I'm a theater director or something. This was 10 years on afterwards, and these elegant women in black dresses who are about 28 years old barely look at you and yeah, we'll leave your name and we'll go.
Right.
What am I doing? Who do I think I am?
Well, you became something else. What
Yeah,
would you've become an artist in so many different ways.
yeah. I guess I feel like if I had to say anything, and I've been very fortunate and privileged in my life that I can afford it and do it, that to self-express, is gives me the greatest joy. And I love collaborating when it's possible. I love collaborating. I'm in a troupe called Playback for Change, which is an improvisational theater troupe right now. And I love the people in that. And there's about 12 of us. And
Yes, I went to go see a performance of it. You weren't there because you
right,
were,
you were
yeah,
there.
Kristen was there,
Yeah,
where they were doing these improvisations and therapeutic. They were drawing stories out of the audience and doing therapeutic improvisations about them. And there were musicians, and there was a sense of welcomeness and openness and just joy at creation and community that
yeah.
is so different from the commercial, even the nonprofit theater world.
And every time we do a show, it's completely different because depending on the stories we get and the mood and all that. So anyway, I do like collaborating, but I'm in the improv mode at this point. And for my 80th birthday, I got together and rehearsed about 12 songs I had written, and with a guy who was brutal with me to get me to learn how to play it right because I'm not a very good piano player. And I had a little band and we played, and that was fun. But I can't keep that up. That's
Oh,
not,
well.
I just can't. I like playing. Just like
Well,
playing.
you described, we'll close with the sort of central metaphor of your book, which is the fun house.
Yeah.
You talk about the sort of carnival fun houses you knew as a kid and San Francisco wharves, and everything that you found as being enjoyable and worth exploring in your life, you likened to like a fun house, a place where you can play and then, enjoy, explore, and then walk out of again. Does that suit you even today?
And I want to add the component of sharing it with others. When I make a fun house, I definitely want to share it with others. It's not just about me or for me, but it has to be for me and about me to start it because you've got to create, you've got to go tap into what you personally can contribute. And once that happens, then yeah, invite in the world and share. I think it's very important, especially in this time we're in right now. If you have the
Yes.
ability to share and bring people together, do so.
That's a wonderful note to end this conversation on, Tom. Thank you for bringing us to that moment. Gives my heart a little happiness to leave it right there. It's wonderful to see you. Hopefully, we have something that we can again share with other people. I think that's such a great way to think about it. You're not just enjoying yourself; you're enjoying to spread it around and to create a new community with it, with what you've created. All right, Tom Bissinger, thank you so much for being on Adventures in Theater History.
Thank you, Peter.
So that's my conversation with Tom, which I'm so very glad to get into the public record. By the way, there's a lot more great stuff in that book of his, The Fun House, for aficionados of Philly history, including Tom's account of his acquaintance with the infamous Ira Einhorn, the evil guru of the Philly counterculture scene during the 1970s. The guy who once ran for mayor, the guy who claimed to have invented Earth Day, and who eventually murdered his girlfriend and stuffed her dismembered body into a trunk and then went on the lam for decades. Yeah, that guy. It's all in there. But that, and much more besides, like Tom's childhood years, his journey down to Selma in 1965, his time in the South Street scene of the early 1970s, and his eventual marriage and the raising of his lovely family, were all far outside the province of this podcast, so I recommend the book to you. If you want to know more, I'll put a link to how you can get a copy in the show notes. Finally, thanks to all of you who wrote to me after the last episode of the podcast and who shared with me their own thoughts and fears about the ongoing, terrifying current historical moment we all find ourselves in. I appreciate so much your words of encouragement. I'm hoping to keep going with the work of this podcast, and I have some other interviews on tap to share with you. I'm hoping in particular to talk about the histories of the Freedom Theater, the Philadelphia Company, and the Wilma Theater in the coming weeks and months, but I don't want to be more definite about when episodes will come out at this point because much remains uncertain, both here and, well, everywhere. But thank you all, as always, for listening and supporting this podcast and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.